Contrary to what diehard dwarf fans and people who get difficulty checked by Renala summoning an entire zoo in her second stage think, wizards are cool. Who here doesn't at least somewhat like the idea of waving their hand, speaking some funny words fit for a magic man, and then using the power of the Aether to obliterate some poor dude who was just going about his day? I know I think that every time I get caught in traffic. Wizards are fun. Let's not pretend otherwise. In Warhammer, wizards sure enough are still fun. With a caveat. Wizards are fun to watch do their thing because, again, slinging fireballs is awesome. But unlike almost any other setting, no one actually wants to be a wizard in Warhammer. No one likes you, for starters. That by itself isn't too uncommon across settings, like The Witcher, but in Warhammer, people really don't like you. You're getting burned at the stake if enough people catch wind of what you are. To top that off, your wizard powers come from hell. Every time you cast a spell, you're rolling the dice on if Satan takes notice and decides to mess with you. In Warhammer Fantasy, there are a few ways to counter this. Training at the colleges of magic, focusing on a single wind of magic to harness them as best you can. But in 40k, well, there are ways to counteract Psyker dangers as well. The problem is, the most common of them comes from the barrel of a gun. Welcome to the life of being a space wizard, fellas. It only gets worse from here. But before we begin, are you listening to this video on the go? If so, I have the perfect thing for you, because this message is sponsored by Raycon. Raycon's bone conduction headphones use off-ear audio. What this means is they don't just play sound, they send the vibrations directly through your bones. You get crystal clear quality, but you can still hear the world around you. If you're doing chores and need to listen for the door, going for a run, or anything else where you need to hear the world around you, they're perfect for the occasion. And with a 13-hour battery life, being waterproof and dustproof, rest easy knowing they're built to last. And of course, while the quality is as great as you'd expect, the price is half the cost of rival brands. Your ears are happy, and your wallet is even happier. I like to use them while I write. It's nice to listen to some music or a podcast, but not completely drown out the world around me. And with the bone conduction headphones, if someone calls me or my dog starts barking, I know I'll be able to hear it. Black Friday is around the corner. Raycon audio products are up to 30% off site-wide. From everyday essentials to the latest releases, it's the perfect time to upgrade your sound or get ahead on gifting. These deals won't last long. Shop now before they're gone. Just click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/pancreasnoworkbc to save on Raycon audio products site-wide. If you want quality headphones and more, you can do no better than Raycon, so grab yourself a pair today. Now then, go Gadget Wizard Head Explosion. Psykers have been in 40k from the beginning, from both its inception as a game and in the in-universe narrative. You can look at Rogue Trader itself, the holy origin of all things 40k, to see that psychic powers were very much a thing, even in the 80s. Fun fact, the Eldar had only about a 75% chance of actually being psychic back in those days, which is funny to read about compared to modern lore where most of the tech they use requires psychic powers to activate. Imagine being born as an Eldar and told that everything more advanced than a push door was beyond your ability to operate. In the universe of 40k, we go all the way back to the War in Heaven, to the Old Ones, to see what the pinnacle of Psyker power could be. Billions of years ago, there were the Old Ones. They were advanced and evolved so far that they became immortal, godlike energy beings that could twist reality to their whims. Kind of like the Forerunners from Halo, only with more outright wizardry and less brutalist architecture. While their exact history is best saved for another time, their power was unquestionable. Using their psychic might, they uplifted, if not outright created, countless races across the galaxy, some of which, such as the Eldar and Orks, are still around in the setting's modern day. They created the webway through psychic machines, tunneling between reality and the warp to create an entirely separate realm. There was essentially nothing that they couldn't do with their powers, and part of this, I'm willing to bet, was the nature of how psychics work in 40k. As I said in the beginning, Psykers draw from the warp. Alright, I said hell, but most of the time that's the same thing here. At this point in the timeline of 40k when the old ones were still around, however, the warp wasn't the warp. Not as we know it anyways. The Sea of Souls at the time was a peaceful, tranquil afterlife sort of deal. Everything was calm, and at a certain point there could be found different gods running around doing god stuff. Impregnating mortals, living in heaven, surely that sort of ancient myth deal was rampant. The warp, however, is a reflection of real space, and particularly the emotions of those that dwell within real space. It isn't a complete one-to-one, if only because I don't think it's physically possible for something like Khorne's never-ending battleground where everyone respawns to exist in reality, but they're deeply connected. If everyone is peaceful and nice, then the Sea of Souls is peaceful and nice. It stands to reason that even aside from the old ones, any nascent Psykers at this point of the setting's history would have little if any worry about severe repercussions from using their powers. Beyond the effects whatever the power was, of course. If you throw around fireballs like an idiot, you'll still get burned. You just won't be targeted by demons for doing so. But if everyone in reality is suddenly stressed out and dying from, say, the events of a galaxy-spanning war so massive that the casualties of every war the Imperium ever fought would be a rounding error by comparison, then the Sea of Souls is going to get a bit turbulent. Sure enough, enter the war in heaven. The Necrontyr becoming the robotic Necrons would probably be enough to cause some pretty hefty warp problems on its own, but when they declared war on the old ones and basically everyone else along with them, reality was in for one hell of a ride. The massive disturbances this conflict caused in the warp turned the Sea of Souls into the warp, and set the stage for it to become the realm of chaos and birth the chaos gods themselves. While I'm unsure if this has ever been mentioned, I would wager that during the height of the war in heaven, something similar to miscasting a Psyker power would finally be possible. This is very much conjecture, but the warp roiled like a hurricane, and while I'm sure the old ones were able to handle it, lesser Psykers might have for the first time been open to something going wrong with the spellcasting process itself. Of course, the war in heaven ended, decisive Eldar victory, Cope and Seath Necron fans, and while the Sea of Souls never became as calm as it once was, it did settle down a fair bit. The Eldar were free to reincarnate as they pleased, and until Asurian put up a border between reality and the warp, they could freely visit the afterlife if they so wished. Some extrapolating is being done here again by me, but it does stand to reason that the warp had to be at least somewhat stable for them to be able to pop into their pantheon's backyard for a barbecue on a whim. Cut forward millions of years, however, and we reach not only the rise of humanity, but the fall of the Eldar. For mankind's part, Psyker powers first began appearing en masse sometime during the Dark Age of technology. The warp was stable-ish, and so human Psykers initially weren't too pressed to be super careful with everything. Some planets were a bit medieval with their treatment of these newfound Psykers and burned them at the stake, but others let them live, and for a while, things were alright. But all the while, the Eldar were busy getting their hedonism on, and for a race as psychically powerful as them, this caused tremendous problems in the warp. It once again roiled as it did during the War in Heaven, as the fourth and final Chaos God was beginning to be born from their collective subconsciousness and actions. Human Psykers began to suffer from it, at worst either accidentally summoning demons from the warp or outright becoming a Chaos Rift themselves, because that is a thing that can happen to Psykers. By the time Slaanesh was born, the warp was completely screwed, a realm of literal nightmares filled with demons and overall the most party-killing vibes imaginable. It's probably been permanently ruined to be as such from now on. Mankind's Psykers went haywire because of this, contributing heavily to the Age of Strife as those planets that didn't get all burned the witch on them suffered from psychic problems worldwide. Having said that, it should be acknowledged that the few planets that managed to learn about using Psyker powers safely, such as Prospero, also survived, so no, they didn't need to kill all those Psykers. It was just easier. Psyker powers for all who are cursed with them are now incredibly dangerous for all but the most well-trained and equipped of beings. Drawing power from the hellscape of the warp always has the risk of drawing attention from the forces of chaos, and at the slightest lapse in control or caution, they can wreak havoc in the real world using the Psyker as a conduit. Their souls burn brighter in the warp than anyone else, constantly drawing the attention of chaos even if they don't actively use their powers. And this has largely been how psychics remain up to the modern day of the setting. Psychic awakening theoretically increased how many Psykers have been born, especially amongst humanity, but in practice, they're still rare, they still blow themselves up a lot, and they get purged for being a witch a whole lot more than either of the previous two things. Sometimes if you're just a bit weird, you get purged for being a Psyker. Sorry, Chief, you shouldn't have been as socially awkward as you were in high school. To reiterate the possession bit though, the danger of being possessed or otherwise corrupted by chaos cannot be understated. This is how Psykers tend to go out of control if they aren't shot by other Imperials. Once chaos gets a foothold, it's hooking its claws into a Psyker until they can rip it open into a portal, possess it, or just plain old make a power misfire and cause problems that way. While all Psyker powers for the average person are thrown under the blanket of witchcraft and therefore equally reviled, there's a massive variety of things that you can do with Psyker powers. In a similarity to Warhammer Fantasy that I presume is on purpose, human Psykers tend to specialize heavily into one thing. If a human Psyker is a telepath, they're going to be a damn good telepath. They're not likely to throw around fireballs, however, at least not especially impressive ones. This isn't a hard set rule, not to the degree of fantasy anyways, but it's a decent enough general rule of thumb to go by. As for some of those disciplines, you can be a telepath, you can do telekinesis, you can be a pyromaniac, geomancy, biomancy, damn near anything you can think of that's a wizard power can be a psychic power as well. All Psykers also have something called witch sight, where they can see the aura of someone who isn't actively protecting or hiding it. They can get glimpses of a person's personality and intentions based off of this. That's right, folks. Hot Topic Goths and their obsession with crystals and auras has canonical basis in 40k. Psykers have plenty of dangers they face even beyond being possessed by chaos. Enslavers, for instance, are funny creatures that live in the warp that love to enslave and lay psychic brain eggs in people. Since Psykers interact with the warp more than anyone else, they're at particularly high risk of this happening. Blanks, which depending on what you read are either people without a soul or people with a negative soul, and no, I have no idea how to make sense of that, inherently dampen the warp. Normal people feel uneasy around them and dislike them even without a reason to. Psykers tend to have seizures whenever they come near, and their powers don't affect the blank and potentially might not be causable at all if there's a blank nearby. Necrons at their pylons can also dampen psychic powers entirely. If they were strong enough to start closing the Eye of Terror, you can bet your ass some random human wizard doesn't have a chance of overpowering the effects of those things. But for all the suffering and prejudice they must face, they get to be space wizards. Throw lightning at the people trying to hang you for witchcraft if you gotta. Chances are the Inquisition will hunt you down, and if not, then chaos will almost certainly get you eventually, but until then, it might be a pretty sweet gig. To get the big man out of the way first, the Emperor of Mankind was/is humanity's greatest psyker. Although, let's be frank here, if he wasn't a god during the Great Crusade, he sure as hell is one now, so I don't know how much he counts anymore as a psyker. Most psykers don't have the ability to automatically undo chaos, corruption, and warp nonsense with the powers of their soul. Usually it's quite the opposite occurrence. But by technical definition, and during the Great Crusade at the latest, Big E was in fact a psyker. Bringing this up as a psyker to avoid discrimination is not advised though. He's a god, of course he can use magic powers without issue. You're a squeaky meatbag who's as likely to blow yourself up as not. As for everyone else, by and large the planets of the Imperium hate psykers. Way back in the day, the Emperor said all psychic powers were a big no-no at the Council of Nicaea, but while technically never being overturned, even non-space marines have essentially decided to ignore it, assuming they even know of its existence. Mankind has been trained for 10,000 years to abhor the witch, and witch hunts are in fact one of the most common pastimes in the Imperium. That said, capturing them is preferable. Not because of any humanitarian concerns, you hippie, but because even the lives of witches are the Emperor's currency, and you should spend them well if you can. Across the planets of the Imperium, a fleet known as the Black Ships roam the galaxy, and every few decades or even centuries will visit a given planet for one simple purpose: grab all the psykers that planet has captured, but not executed. This is one of two, technically three purposes of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, playing a never-ending game of hide-and-seek with psykers before they can either be executed or get themselves killed. Depending on the lore you read, the Black Ships have either always been crewed by Sisters of Silence, who as blanks are essentially immune to psykers, or for a while Sisters of Battle and Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, who are so loyal and/or faithful that any psykers trying to cause problems on the Black Ships will be promptly dealt with. Once you're on the Black Ships, it's deeply unpleasant for you as a psyker. The Imperium thinks you're garbage, so you're treated as garbage. The cells on these ships are warded in all sorts of anti-warp measures, which no doubt causes great discomfort for the psyker, and at the slightest signs of a problem, you're getting blammed. This is one of the largest fleets in the galaxy, dwarfing even the Mechanicus forces as well as entire gene lines worth of space marines. It has to be. The Emperor needs his psykers, and while more and more human psykers are born every year, there's still a vast rarity amongst the Imperial populace. No one knows exactly how many of these ships there are, and if you want to get on one, you need to be a damn important person to be potentially interfering with their duty. From here, two further fates await you, assuming again you aren't killed or die on board. The worst fates awaits those who are either too powerful, not powerful enough, or too unstable to be made useful in the wider Imperium. These fine folks are destined for the Golden Throne itself to be used as food for the Emperor of Mankind. Psykers fed to Big E, to my knowledge, actually do live decent-ish lives when they arrive on Terra and await their final destination. And then when their time is up, they get plugged into a battery and their very soul is used to funnel life force into the Emperor of Mankind to keep him around and the Astronomicon running just a little bit longer. Agony doesn't even begin to describe this, and at the end of it all, their souls either merge with the Emperor's or just fade into nothing. About the only nice thing about this process is that I'm pretty sure it turns the psyker into ash, so at least cleanup is nice and easy. For those the Black Ships think can be used outside of afternoon snacks, however, they get the chance to become sanctioned psykers. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica's second branch, the Scholastia Psychana, is, as you can guess from the name, dedicated to training psykers how to use their powers in a somewhat safe way. To be clear to you though, until you graduate from wizard school, the possibility of you getting shipped off to become Emperor Chow is ever present. The training is grueling, involving looking into the warp, teaching how to defend your mind from mental predations, and all in all, it's Navy SEALs training, but for wizards, and is as brutal as that sounds. Anyone who makes it out of this tends to be mentally scarred, and the entire process is kept fairly secretive to outsiders. Graduates will tend to be on good terms with at least each other since they went through the same trials, but the training that is almost entirely unique to them further isolates them from mankind as a whole. Sanctioned battle psykers aren't the only thing to come out of the Psychana. Astropaths are the most common product of Wizard School, what with them being the only way the Imperium can reliably communicate from world to world without resorting to sending ships on actual courier runs. For the somewhat abridged version, astropaths are how the Imperium communicates with itself. Taken before the Golden Throne itself and soulbound to the Emperor himself, they're taught almost entirely things like divination and psychic interpretation, for their job requires them to be able to interpret the oftentimes choppy messages other astropaths send their way. They can also be gathered into astropathic choirs, which in some cases are powerful enough together to breach the shadow and the warp, which otherwise blocks psychic powers quite effectively. The process of being sandblasted by their god's soul is a rough one, however, and many come out traumatized if not insane, or dead. But while they aren't completely immune to chaos corruption, they're far safer than anyone else given that Big E has on some level personally touched their essence. Astropaths are viewed by many as little more than living radio sets, repeating what they're told to who they need to tell it to and then waiting for the next batch of orders. Them not usually being the best in a fight as far as Psykers go doesn't help with this either. As Caiaphas Cain puts it, he only began to find out the truth of what makes them as they are later in his life, but it's safe to assume that's how most Imperials view them. At least there is a little bit less suspicion towards them, if only because they aren't casting insane powers too often. It's easier to trust the guy whose dreams double as a radio than it is the guy who can switch your brain with your butthole on a whim. Since they communicate with each other by sending psychic messages that amount to directed dreams being beamed into another astropath's brain, communication is often spotty and reliant on interpretation. But it's better than no FTL communication, so until someone invents the 40k version of the HPG network, It Came to Me in a Dream is canonically how every 40k character is sending messages across the galaxy. Those who become normal sanctioned psykers are the kinds of folk you see in things like Dawn of War. For all that the Imperium hates the Witch, everyone knows that on some level being able to fling magical fireballs at your enemy is both badass and tactically helpful. Frequently you will find these people in the service of an Inquisitor as part of their retinue, and on extremely rare occasions, a graduate psyker of the Psychana might even get to become an Inquisitor themselves. With the vast amount of disciplines and powers available to a psyker, it's no wonder that Inquisitor would find use for these folk. Gregor Eisenhorn himself is a psyker, and Amberly Vale has one named Raquel as part of her crew. If you forget what her powers actually were in the Caiaphas Cain books, I don't blame you, because I can't remember either, since Cain spends 1 part talking about her to 10 part talking about how fat her tits are every time she shows up. The most powerful Psykers to come out of the Psychana become Primaris Psykers, also known as Psyker Lords or Battle Psykers. These are the lads sent to the front lines alongside the Imperial Guard to rain magical hellfire down on the Emperor's enemies. In spite of the Guard's usual attitudes towards the safety of its soldiery, Primaris Psykers actually have a large amount of safeguards put into keeping them alive. Presumably because of the investment that goes into making one, they have a variety of things such as psychic hoods, crystals, and wires in their brain to bleed away excess warp energy. Their staffs are made of the highest quality material and psychoreactive whatever terminology, and overall, every effort to keep them safe from demonic possession is made. 40k is still 40k though, and sometimes even the finest of safety measures isn't enough to stop chaos from doing what chaos does best and making everyone's lives worse. In these cases, there's almost always a commissar on hand to blow their heads smooth off before they either become possessed or mutate into a chaos spawn. Remember kids, magical powers are all well and good, but Sam Colt was really cooking when he made all men equal. Human Psykers are a bit all over the place in terms of power. The Emperor and Magnus I'm not even going to count, because whatever the hell is going on with them, the word natural is not applicable. The end result of humanity's Psyker powers is also unknown. The Emperor said that humanity could one day rival or even surpass the psychic might of the Eldar. This line of thought makes me want to vomit, because of course the Space Elves are said to not even be the endgame of wizardry, but perhaps in Dragon Ball Z power level turns, the Emperor is right. Pound for pound, human Psykers might one day be able to overpower Eldar equivalents. The Eldar were either created or uplifted to be the ultimate psychic weapon against the Necrons, however. They were purpose-built to be wizards, and their control, as such, is unmatched. Their chief god Asurian may have even spread some of his power across the entire Eldar race shortly before Slaanesh ate him, making them even better at it. Human Psykers, meanwhile, even the most well-trained of Primaris Psykers and Space Marine librarians, are throwing fireballs around like morons and diving headfirst into the warp with every power cast. One day, humanity might have been able to equal the Eldar. but their control would never be as good, and between the warp being the shithole it is and mankind by and large killing Psykers before anything else, it's almost certain that outcome is gone for good. Thankfully, however, the Imperium did at one point have one of its few bureaucratic wins and created a handy way of classifying Psyker levels of power. We'll start from the low end and work our way up, although the scale does go into negatives for blanks and whatnot, which we will ignore for the time being. 5/row levels are where most people are at. This is your average person, neither psychic or psychically dull. There's nothing that lets them cast powers, but they also require some kind of outside interference to be possessed. Demons can't just slip into normal people's brains. There needs to be something like a cursed artifact or a warp rift nearby for that to happen. Going up to the next rough level, we have Kappa/Lambda/Mu/Nu/Z/Omicron. This is where someone is in fact a Psyker, but not one really worth classifying as such. Have you ever met someone absurdly lucky? They could call a coin toss every single time, always got that double 6 out of jail in Monopoly, always rolled well in tabletop games. Those are the kinds of Psyker powers that people at this level exhibit. It's not truly using their powers for anything but parlor tricks at the most, and usually occurrences at this level are subconscious. As part of their job to find witches, Inquisitors will in theory look out for people at this level, and since they are Psykers, the things that make them stand out can get them burned at the stake for being witches. But for the most part, they'll often go unnoticed, and if they are noticed, they aren't nearly powerful enough to be made sanctioned Psykers and are instead sent immediately to the Golden Throne. As long as you don't go around advertising your fortune-telling service that's suspiciously accurate, however, this level of Psyker is likely to go unnoticed as one for their entire lives, save a chance encounter with a blank or something like that. Moving up to Eta, Theta, and Iota levels is where we get true Psykers. Though not particularly powerful, they can learn and hone their powers to become able to practice the various psychic disciplines that exist in the setting. It isn't going to be a particularly awe-inspiring display of power, and I'd wager that the most common outcome for Psykers at this level is to become astropaths, but these are officially true space wizards. Epsilon and Zeta Psykers, meanwhile, are where we start getting the big hitters, the people who can fire Toho levels of mind bullets at their enemy on a whim. At this level, Psykers are considered truly dangerous to those around them, beings using fundamentally unnatural forces to wield terrible power. In spite of that, the Imperium still trains them in the Scala Psychana, and will be happy to attach them to a guard regiment as a Primaris Psyker. No one may like the Witch, but everyone likes when the Witch burns the Ork horde you're facing. If I had to hazard a guess, I would also say that this is, on average, where your basic Eldar is at least if they decide to begin focusing on psychic powers rather than one of the more martial paths. That's blatant guesswork on my part, though. Don't take that as certified canon. Further on up, we hit Gamma and Delta, which is the upper limit of what the Imperium will consider using in battle or as part of some dude or other's retinue. Very few things are out of their reach, and they are capable of unmaking entire zip codes if they truly let loose. A hurricane of hellfire is something you should expect, and while everyone is careful around them, the Imperium knows that these lads are exceptionally good at dealing with enemies. Their power cannot be understated, because while the following levels are where we hit truly absurd amounts of power, a Gamma or Delta grade Psyker can still crush a Leman Russ like a soda can if they're so inclined. Once we hit Beta and Alpha Psykers, however, the Imperium can no longer stomach using them as they do weaker ones. The stronger you are as a Psyker, the more vulnerable you are to chaos corruption or good old-fashioned insanity. The whispers and the warp that all Psykers face are going to be exceptionally loud at this point, and while a rare few at this level can control it, the vast majority of human Alpha and Beta Psykers are utterly insane. Largely, they're sent to the Golden Throne, although a very small few, are selected to partake in the training for the Grey Knights to see if they can't become one of the Emperor's finest weapons instead. And from here, we hit the realm of utter nonsense. Alpha Plus, and if you really want to get granular with it, you can go to Beta Plus all the way to Omega Plus. While those following classifications do have technical terminology and degrees of power, Alpha Plus essentially means that you're so psychically powerful that you've broken the scale. Making any kind of accurate measurements of these levels of power is impossible and largely just thought experiments, because this is where you find figures like Eldrad, Magnus the Red, and the Emperor of Mankind prior to his entombment. Any humans found at this level are either shot on sight, or if containment is possible, immediately shipped out to the Golden Throne to be drained, because the potential for demonic possession or them going rogue is something the Imperium cannot allow. These kinds of figures are where we start getting comic book or anime levels of nonsense, where they can stop time and casually wave their hands to destroy an entire fleet of warships from 3 solar systems away. If you manage to hit something like the theoretical Omega Plus level, you are just Tzeentch. This is a level of psychic power and mastery that organic brains burn out at, and you're almost certainly an old one or some other sort of being that's partly or wholly magical in nature. One last note before we go on is that depending on your status in the Imperium, some Psykers are respected to a degree. The average person will probably hate you still, but other Imperial officials will often hold the word of a sanctioned Psyker in high regard. Even beyond the potential for them to be seeing the future, always a handy thing for a commander to know if nothing else, they see the world in a different light than normal humans. Just about every Imperial will fear them, but there is some vague sense of mystique and wonder going into being a sanctioned Psyker that means a lot of people will at the very least listen carefully when they speak. You don't have to like the wizard's existence to know that when gods and demons are a proven fact in your universe, they probably know what they're on about. And of course, as Space Marines, librarians are always at least somewhat respected by normal humans. Their training is even more rigorous, and in exchange, they're better than normal humans at controlling their powers. Still not as good as the Eldar, though. This section will be a bit shorter than you might think, largely because the broad strokes of Imperial Psykers can be said for Chaos Psykers as well. Sometimes, Psykers go mad. Driven to insanity by the whispers of chaos or outright demonic influence in their lives, sometimes they become rogue Psykers. Not all serve chaos, of course. A rogue Psyker is just a Psyker that isn't submitting to Imperial training and the collar on their neck that this entails. But since Psykers draw from the warp, rogue Psykers frequently result in demonic intrusions into real space, and many will also begin serving chaos or a specific chaos god. Chaos Psykers, especially those with the backing of Tzeentch like a Thousand Sun Sorcerer, can access greater levels of power on average than anyone else. Even more so than the Eldar, because these ones are being inundated with warp energy and embracing it like no others do. Alpha Plus Psykers and whatnot can show up among any psychic race without specific intervention from Chaos, but if you take two Gamma level Psykers and let one of them go nuts with Tzeentch worship, they'll be the stronger of the two most likely. They can theoretically, and that is a load-bearing theoretically, also be safer in some ways than non-Chaos Psykers. Inundated in the warp as they are, it's kind of like how you can make yourself inoculated to poison by microdosing it. Like the story of that one guy who tried to kill himself via poison to avoid the Romans, only to fail because he spent his entire life microdosing every poison he came across. Don't know if that's historically accurate, but it's a fun story. That theoretical safety applies to very few, however, because chaos is chaos. Even if you are favored by Tzeentch, that might mean he screws you over because he's Tzeentch. Plenty of Thousand Sons have found that out the hard way. Beyond that, being inundated by chaos at all times is a great way to mutate or die outright. Chaos power is not a boon to become ascendant no matter what followers of the gods say. It's hyper-steroids for your soul. With that earlier analogy, chances are you aren't microdosing the poison. Most Chaos Psykers are instead chugging the Kool-Aid. You'll be throwing around psychic powers like no one else, and likely a Chaos Psyker will have access to abilities no one else has ever seen, but your soul is undoubtedly forfeit in the end. Also, side tangent, does anyone know if a Lord of Change is technically a Psyker, or any other demon that uses psychic powers for that matter? I know that sounds like an obvious yes, but Psykers are living beings using the power of the warp, and demons are made out of warp stuff. Which also incidentally means that when a demon casts a spell at you, you can make the argument it's like them throwing a pile of demon meat as a weapon. I'm sure I'm probably just being dumb, but I am genuinely curious if under the definition of a Psyker, that psychic demons technically qualify as one. It'd be meaningless if they don't technically qualify, because they absolutely can cast psychic powers, but I'm curious if the wording disqualifies them. As I've already said, the Eldar are an entirely psychic race. All of them can communicate with things like telepathy if they so choose, and while not all of them practice truly powerful disciplines, all of them have the potential to become greater than all but humanity's most plot armor-covered Psykers. I am looking at you, Chief Librarian Tigurius. The reason they don't go all out with Psyker powers is the same reason they wear soul stones and everything in Craftworld society is the way it is. Slaanesh. Because of their ancestors' folly, if they tap a bit too deeply into the warp, Slaanesh may take notice and decide to snatch them out of reality and eat them, and if they're lucky, they get eaten through her mouth. The average Craftworlder could go nuts with Psyker powers and eliminate whatever is in front of them. It's just that it's a one-way ticket to damnation if they do. Consequently, Azerman setting up the path system resulted in the Path of the Seer. Training the Eldar to carefully use psychic powers and draw exactly as deeply from the warp as they need and no further, Eldar Psykers come in a myriad of different forms depending on what they focus on and their prior history. For example, a Warlock isn't just a particular job that an Eldar in the Path of the Seer may decide they like. Those seers are ones who have previously served as an aspect warrior beforehand, and they combine their martial skills with their psychic abilities. Farseers themselves are the path of the seers equivalent to exarchs, those Eldar who have become lost on the path and can no longer change which one they follow. Spirit seers specialize in communing with the dead, and are the ones who wake Wraithguard up from their slumber. Even something like a Bone Singer is technically an Eldar on the path of the seer, albeit one who utilizes their psychic talent to grow Wraithbone and create basically everything the Eldar ever use. Harlequin Psykers also exist, Shadow Seers being the military Psykers they have at present on the tabletop, and they're largely devoted to making the enemy magically trip balls as the clowns run back and forth across the battlefield. A wizard-induced acid trip is a great way to both enhance the ratings of their shows and keep their enemies from properly responding in a fight. Harlequins are their own beast, and so they don't have the same exact traditions and protections that the Craftworlders have, but they also have the only whole and active Eldar god backing them up, so they likely have Kegarak to keep them safe from the worst of psychic power backlashes. Since the Eldar are naturally terrified of Slaanesh, their protections don't just stop at training to be careful with the warp. Eldar ghost helms worn by Farseers are the least of some of the best methods of defending against warp mishaps, to the point that when the psychic phase was still a thing, a Farseer was basically never going to suffer from a psychic miscast because of them. Basically never, to reiterate before someone with extremely shitty luck crawls up my ass about the time their Farseer exploded into meat during a match. Eldar Seers also adorn themselves with magical runes that act as power limiters. If an Eldar nears the limit of what they can safely draw, the runes will burn out and prevent them from going any further. These can be overridden, and an Eldar who does such a thing will likely be causing the kind of psychic storm that turns an entire planet into a lifeless husk, but their souls are almost immediately sucked up by She Who Thirsts when they do this. Fun fact, when I was typing that line out, She Who Thirsts autocorrected to She Who Thrusts, which I'm sure is also an accurate name for Slaanesh. The Eldar will also rarely, if ever, focus on the more destructive kinds of psychic powers. They absolutely can, of course. Anyone who's played them in Dawn of War knows that the Eldar have a few psychic powers that can cause a whole lot of damage to enemy units. But at risk of repeating myself too much, the more you draw from the warp, the more you may draw the attention of Chaos and Slaanesh in particular, and massive lightning storms are bright in both the material and immaterial worlds. So they limit themselves even further. Most of the powers they use are things like divination or low-key telekinesis. That first one indeed is the realm of Farseers, who can see the future with unparalleled accuracy short of someone like Kairos Fateweaver or Orkan the Diviner, who is technically cheating by just traveling back in time and telling you what he saw in the future. A quick look at the Farseers datasheet shows that while they do have Eldritch Storm, their other powers are far more subtle, letting a single roll count as a 6, or giving +1 to hit on the unit they lead's attack rolls. Unfortunately, in spite of all they have going for them, when Eldar Seers show up, they tend to be jokes compared to what codices tell us about them. I have 3 explanations for this, for both tabletop, lore, and out of universe. The tabletop explanation is that GW removes stacking modifiers. Prior to this, Eldar Psykers were every bit as powerful as codices made them out to be, because you would be informed when shooting at a given Eldar unit that the Eldar player had cast the same spell on it 5 times, and now you suffered from a -50 to hit them. Understandably infuriating to deal with, but removing that does take away from their mechanical power. In lore, as I said, the Eldar do not focus too much on the more destructive aspects of their powers. This extends well past them just being Psykers. The Eldar have a whole bevy of super weapons like the Fireheart they could use to obliterate their enemies with ease. If they use them, however, they're at risk of falling back into the same slide into hedonism that birthed Slaanesh, so they refuse to if there's even the slightest chance of another possibility working out. This is why they not only don't focus on one extremely damaging big spell, but tend to spread out their repertoire of psychic powers, avoiding becoming too focused on one thing too much and potentially becoming obsessed. This does to some extent fly in the face of the path system, which isn't perfection because them being created at their given path is just a natural result of doing the same thing for 100 years, but with warp nonsense and the risk of drawing too deeply from it existing, it does make sense a bit for this situation. No one's gonna become obsessed with being the perfect dishwasher, but some people might become obsessed with potentially being able to snap planets out of existence if they train hard enough. The meta reason for this is that they are the Eldar. When an Eldar fights a human character, chances are the human is the protagonist of the story, and so the Eldar being the space elves and the greatest Psykers naturally means nothing in the face of whichever space marine librarian is in the spotlight this time. That and unoriginal writing is also how we get the classic Farseer plotline of I predicted the future, but the future had changed, and then we're expected to act shocked at the reveal. If you would like my own personal brand of coping about it, the reason we see Eldar Seers so frequently fail in stories and look like idiots is a simple one. When an Eldar Seer is successful, no one knows about it. The event they foresaw and took efforts to prevent simply didn't happen. They put the rock in the right place, the right person tripped, and then 500 years later what would have been a massive bloodbath for not only the Eldar but countless others simply didn't happen. The end result of a successful Farseer is silence, but if that sounds boring to you, consider that it's a silence that's born from the fact that an entire civilization never gets the chance to be born and threaten the craft worlds. In the same way the Tyranids always lose because no one is left to see their victories, you always see Eldar Seers defeated because they're either holding themselves back, or their victory can only be proved by an event that they themselves kept from occurring. For some smaller fun facts, the Eldar seem to be immune from getting grabbed by Slaanesh if they happen to be in an area of the warp controlled by another Chaos God. The Eldar Psykers that projected into Nurgle's garden to save Isha were able to fight within it for days, which normally when an Eldar enters the warp, they have moments before they're gone. Of course, that does mean they're instead in someone like Nurgle or Tzeentch's backyard, which is horrid on its own, but it is a neat occurrence, if not one that they can really take advantage of. And a somewhat unfun fact is that Eldar Farseers lost in the path of the Seer eventually crystallize. This isn't the only fate of a Seer. Spirit Seers eventually lose the ability to come out of the Infinity Circuit and their bodies turn into a husk, but Farseers, if not slain, eventually become Crystal Seers. Their minds and psychic power are added to the Infinity Circuit, their bodies housed in something called the Dome of Crystal Seers on a craft world. It's supposedly an inescapable fate, though given how closely emotions influence not just the Eldar's powers but their very biology, it can theoretically be pushed back if the Eldar is motivated enough by a given cause. Eldrad, for instance, while he has started in recent years to slowly begin crystallizing, still is out and about doing Eldrad things across the galaxy. The Dark Eldar, as an aside, don't have Psykers. The closest thing would be the Homunculi, who can bring back dead Deldar, which is obviously related to the Warp, and the Mandrakes, who are their own weird thing with their own subdimension, but I presume it's at least part psychic. However they drain their souls would seem to be a psychic power, because that's how they keep themselves young and their souls safe and topped up from Slaanesh's corruption, but apparently this doesn't count as a psyker power. Presumably I'm missing something that makes this click, because eating someone's soul really sounds like wizardry. Talking about Ork Psykers is a pain, I will not lie, because everyone tends to have very strong opinions on how they actually work, and even beyond that, it is a rather confusing thing. So even more than most things I talk about, imagine in your mind a big sign that says allegedly hanging over everything about to come out of my mouth. Sound good? At the end of the day, I think this is the orkest way of doing it regardless, because if the biggest orc says something is a certain way, then that's just how it is for the rest of the boys, even if they're full of shit. All orcs have some kind of psychic field around them. Whatever this field is, their Wa energy field, or whatever name you can come up with for it, it lets them do stuff that just shouldn't work. As I said, the extent of this varies, especially depending on who you ask. On one extreme, there's people saying things like if you get enough orcs to believe that orcs are immune to lava, then they will become immune to lava because they believe it and therefore it becomes true. This extent isn't likely the case. On the other end of the scale, you have people that go, actually, the most it can ever do is make a gun with a 30-round magazine shoot 31 rounds or something like that, which I also reject because that's boring. Have some imagination, dork, the orcs have it. At the very least, it does things like letting vehicles painted red go faster, because the orcs believe red is fast, and so it makes things faster. This field can be supercharged if enough orcs are around and become a physical power source among other things, such as during the War of the Beast. It's highly unstable and prone to exploding, much like the orcs themselves, but when you're a race of beings that love when things just randomly blow up, this isn't a downside. Weird boys, meanwhile, are those orcs that are particularly psychic. They can channel psychic energy through themselves and cast various spells with it, most commonly spells that cause things to explode. Now the problem here, right, is that I don't know if these are technically Psykers. Do they draw from the Wa energy field as opposed to the Warp? Supposedly, but weird boys at least previously were subject to the perils of the Warp special rule. This could simply be because GW didn't want to invent an entirely separate rule solely for Ork Psykers, but at the same time tabletop and lore inform each other, at least in theory. Sisters of Silence and the various blanks also don't typically cause Ork tech to stop working. If they did, then Caiaphas Cain would have loved fighting orcs because Jurgen's presence would turn all their vehicles and weapons into slag. And for that matter, in one story, Cain and Jurgen drove an orc buggy for a while and it was perfectly usable. Uncomfortable as all hell, but if we assume all orc tech works at least partially because of their Gestalt field and it was Psyker related, then Jurgen's field wouldn't have let the engines start. But if it is truly separate, then how come orcs still have abilities with a psychic keyword and units like the Sisters of Silence have advantages against them? The specifics of this are a mess, but at the same time, I would also like to invite you to follow me on this alternate train of thought. The orcs do not care. Things simply work the way they work, and thinking about it means more time spent not getting into a fight, or at least not building something that will make the next fight better. So stop thinking about it, you get. That's how you get crumped. As for some final stuff on Weird Boys, a common joke about sanctioned psychers that's only partially true is that they tend to explode at random. This is mostly untrue, but for Weird Boys, it is only kind of untrue. They're orcs above all else. They like to make things explode in loud and garish ways, and sometimes when you cast the spell that causes the foot of one of your gods to stomp your enemies flat, the backlash smashes your own head flat too. Orcs may not be the biggest fan of Weird Boys, but for the most part, they're definitely fans of what kind of mayhem Weird Boys can unleash. My summary of Ork Psykers thusly is such. It ain't worth thinking about. There could be a myriad of reasons as to why things are the way they are with the orcs, and figuring out the answer probably isn't going to stop you from getting crumped. Sometimes things can have deep and impactful explanations. Sometimes the explanation doesn't matter in the slightest. In this case, I would wager the answer is both. Now pick up your chopper and get swinging. The galaxy at large, of course, has had plenty of other psychic races that can exist. Ogrins, for instance, for the longest time were considered unable to be psychers on account of being too stupid. I highly contest that as ever being valid even in older lore, because you look at an orc and tell me with a straight face that someone can be too stupid to be some kind of wizard. But then an ogre named Cassia proved everyone wrong on all accounts, for she was not only a psyker, but able to read and write at least a 5th grade level. The Leagues of Votann are mostly similar to the Tau, but artificially, meanwhile, having intentionally dimmed souls to make them harder to spot by demons and the like. They do have Grimnir, though, specially bred clone skins that allow them to access the warp in a safe and controlled manner. Since accessing a Votann requires a bit of psychic know-how, these guys exist to do it, as well as other psyker stuff. And I hate them, but not because of any fault of their lore, it's their name. Grimnir is the dwarf god of war from fantasy, and his chief followers are dwarfs undergoing a religiously mandated suicide quest to die in glorious battle and earn redemption. And that's who Votann wizards are named after. That was the best GW had to name them after. Couldn't have done something with dwarf runes, the other dwarf gods. Nope, they chose the dwarf god best known for people playing Slayer Barded and Vermintide ending a run, because the lore demands they charge into that Skaven patrol right there. Total garbage. Kiss my ass, Arthur Bones, and in fact, everyone go comment Borbo on one of his videos. That's B-O-R-B-O, and you can stretch that last O out to as many O's as you want. The Tau, as you may know, are psychically inert. Going off the earlier scale, they'd presumably rest at the Tau level. Makes sense. Not blanks, they have a warp presence, but a highly dimmed one. Most of their allied races, however, do have some psychic presence. Most prominent to me are the Kroot, who have shamans that sure enough are psychers. The Kroot being able to take on the biology of anything they eat is also apparently such a potent ability that this extends to psychic powers, meaning there's at least one race in the galaxy that can vor their way to being wizards. Obviously, Necrons have no psychers, what with them being soulless robots, but they do have enough ways to screw with them and can even help support psychers in some ways. Blackstone is a funny little substance that can be used to nullify the warp, yes, but it can also be reversed and massively amplify the effects of anything psychic, which is indeed how the Blackstone fortresses work, at least in part. Necrons, if they want, could in theory do a whole lot more than the Silent King with the Pariah Nexus and trying to undo all the warp stuff. If they want, they could adorn some psyker in Blackstone, promise them it makes their powers safer, and then when that poor bastard is sent home and next tries to cast a power, they instantly miscast and open a portal to the warp. It'd be like if you were trying to get some water from your sink, but the tap was secretly tampered with to come out with the force of a fire hose. And we can end on the Tyranids, because much like the Orcs, they too are a bit of a mess. Albeit in this case, I'd say slightly less so. The Tyranid hive mind as a whole is arguably something on the level of a Chaos God or the Emperor. It's a vast intelligence, spread out across an entire species, true, but something clearly on the level of the bigger hitters. When the hive mind can specialize Tyranids to be able to shut down the warp and even warp storms more effectively, you know it's something powerful. And to an extent, some amount of psychic activity is spread throughout the entirety of the Tyranids. The hive mind acts through synapse creatures, which allow lesser Tyranid bioforms to act in unison. If a lesser Tyranid is cut off from a synapse creature, they become little more than feral animals. Insanely dangerous animals, true, but still just animals. As for more outright psyker powers, some beings like zoanthropes can cast psychic powers and all the wizard crap you'd expect. Theoretically, they draw from the Tyranid hive mind, though perils of the warp and all that old rule stuff does put that into question. It's an easier question to answer than it was with the Orcs, however. At least, I think so. The hive mind is spread out across the Tyranids, so it could be that trying to access all its power isn't possible for a single organism, so it just can't. It could also be that there's inefficiencies in each Tyranid synapse creature that means it can't use whatever powers it may perfectly, and there's always a risk of something going wrong, like with lesser Psykers. Or it's just that the hive mind itself is drawing from the warp, and lesser creatures in turn drawing from it is still ultimately coming from the warp, so some levels of shenanigans are to be expected no matter what. And there are beyond them a variety of other random psychic creatures, like the Psychnoin, or whatever those things are called. They're giant wasps that are highly venomous, aggressive, and if you're a Psyker, they'll lay nests in you. Magnus the Red did everyone a solid in one of the few unqualified successes he's ever had in his life and eliminated the ones on Prospero, but there are a few more subspecies still out there. Not very many, thankfully, but there are some. And I think that's a fine enough spot to end it. Bugs that like to lay eggs in Psykers, in case you needed more reason to not want to be a wizard in this setting. And those are Psykers. Between the ever-present threat of possession and corruption, everyone hating you, the situation being even worse depending on which race you are, it's not worth it to be a wizard in 40k. But hey, the voice lines for Guard Psykers and Dawn of War are so hammy and fun that maybe it's worth it, just to be like that guy. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the warp to my Psyker, granting me unlimited power in exchange for the chance I might one day spontaneously explode. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Psyker, I hardly know her. I'm so fucking funny.